I had checked into the Crossroads Motel on the outskirts of a small, desolate town, and it was clear that this place had seen better days. It was the only option for miles, and my weariness from the long drive had left me with no choice but to spend the night there. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting an eerie, intermittent light on the empty parking lot. I hoped for a quiet night's rest, but what I encountered in the motel's lobby would forever haunt my dreams. The lobby was dimly lit, its once lustrous furnishings now faded and threadbare. A row of dusty potted plants sat atop a scarred, wooden reception desk, and a sleepy-looking clerk hunched over it. Her name tag read Linda. I exchanged pleasantries as she handed me a key to room 104. However, as I turned to head down the corridor, I couldn't help but notice another guest sitting on one of the worn-out couches in the lobby. His presence felt odd, as if he were out of place. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him sent shivers down my spine. He was a middle-aged man, disheveled and wild-eyed, staring blankly at the faded painting on the wall. As I passed by him, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that was beyond unsettling. I nodded politely, a nervous smile on my face, and quickened my pace toward my room. Upon entering room 104, I closed the door behind me and exhaled a sigh of relief. The room was as unimpressive as the lobby, a dated and cramped space with peeling wallpaper and a fluorescent light above the bed. I kicked off my shoes and lay on the bed, trying to shake off the unease from my encounter in the lobby. I couldn't help but think that something about that man was off, something I couldn't quite place. As the minutes turned to hours, I began to relax, watching late-night TV and eventually succumbing to sleep. It was a fitful rest, filled with unsettling dreams that I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires and an echoing crash outside jolted me from my sleep. I leaped out of bed, rushed to the window, and peered into the night. There, in the motel's parking lot, I saw the source of the commotion. My heart sank. The man from the lobby was behind the wheel of a mangled car, smoke and steam billowing from the wreckage. Panic set in as I watched him stagger from the driver's seat, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. By the time I rushed down to the lobby, the ambulance had arrived and paramedics were tending to the man's injuries. A police officer was questioning the disoriented man who had a vacant, haunting look in his eyes. I recounted my earlier encounter with him, explaining how his strange demeanor had left me unsettled. The officer thanked me for the information, but didn't provide any further details about the man's condition. Shaken and anxious, I returned to my room, but sleep was now an impossible endeavor. What had brought that man to this desolate motel in such a condition? What horrors or traumas had he experienced? I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I had glimpsed into a nightmarish world of suffering and despair. As the night slowly turned to dawn, I couldn't shake the lingering unease from my chilling encounter with the man from the lobby. I was used to late-night shifts as a room service attendant at the Grand Plaza Hotel. The place had its quirks, but it paid the bills. It was an ordinary evening, and I had an order for room 312, a standard guest room on the third floor. I gathered the tray with a covered plate and a bottle of wine and headed up in the dimly lit elevator. As I approached room 312, I could hear muffled sounds from behind the door. Soft, yet unnerving, like someone whispering. I knocked politely, announcing myself as room service. After a brief pause, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room with heavy curtains drawn to block any outside light. The guest who opened the door was a man, middle-aged, with a haggard expression
and disheveled hair. He was wearing a wrinkled suit, and it was evident that he had seen better days. I greeted him with a polite smile and began setting the tray down on the table, my eyes briefly scanning the room. It was filled with a pungent smell of stale cigarette smoke. The man's gaze was fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. I could feel his eyes, cold and piercing, pouring into me. There was an awkward silence as I uncovered the plate and presented his meal. The room was eerily quiet, and the only sound was my own breathing. As I offered the wine, he reached out to take it, his hand trembling slightly. He spoke in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "You know, I'm not usually one for small talk, but you seem different from the others." I forced a polite chuckle, trying to maintain a professional demeanor. "Different? How so?" I asked, though I had a feeling I didn't want to know his answer. He leaned in closer, his breath stinking of alcohol and something else, something more sinister. "You see, I have this gift," he whispered, as if sharing a forbidden secret. "I can see things, the truth, you know." A chill ran down my spine. The room felt colder, despite the warmth outside. I couldn't move, mesmerized by the strange man's unsettling eyes. He continued, "You have secrets, my friend. We all do, but some secrets are darker than others." I struggled to maintain my composure, trying to finish my service as quickly as possible. I couldn't get out of that room fast enough. As I bid him good night and headed back down to the elevator, the feeling of dread lingered. What had I just encountered? That night, I couldn't sleep. The strange man's words echoed in my mind. His uncanny ability to see something hidden, something darker, filled me with an unsettling sense of paranoia. I questioned every action, every decision I had ever made. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and doubt. The next evening, I received another order for room 312. Dread filled my veins, but I couldn't refuse. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, tray in hand, and hesitated before knocking on that door again. This time it was the smell that hit me first, a rancid odor, stronger than the cigarette smoke. My heart pounded as I knocked, and the door creaked open once more. The man's eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto mine, and there was a wicked grin on his face. As I cautiously entered the room, I couldn't help but glance at the bed. There I saw the source of the rancid smell. A pool of dark, crimson liquid had soaked through the sheets and dripped onto the floor. A sense of horror washed over me. The man gestured to the tray, but I couldn't focus on it. I couldn't ignore the sinister tableau before me. My instincts told me that I needed to leave, that I needed to get out of there as fast as I could. But the man leaned closer, his voice a sinister whisper. "You know what I see, don't you? The truth, my friend." I managed to mutter something about needing to check on another guest and fled the room. Once I was safely out of the hotel, I called the police. The authorities arrived and discovered a gruesome scene in room 312. It turned out that the man had a history of violent crimes and had been on the run. He'd been using the hotel as a hiding place, and I had unwittingly walked into his terrifying world. That chilling encounter haunted me for years. It was a nightmare I couldn't escape. The Grand Plaza Hotel, once a place of mundane late-night work, had transformed into a house of horrors. It reminded me that darkness often lurked where you least expected it, hidden behind the veneer of ordinary life.
I was just a young boy at the time, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and it was one of those family trips that you remember forever. We stayed at the Grand Haven Hotel, a quaint old place in the woods. My parents and I occupied room 23, and despite its rustic charm, the place had an eerie feeling to it, with creaking floors and dimly lit corridors. The trip had been pleasant, filled with hikes, picnics, and stories by the campfire. The day had turned into night, and I drifted off to sleep under the soft, warm sheets, my parents nearby. That's when my nightmare began. I awoke in the middle of the night, disoriented, and called out for my parents. There was no answer. Panic washed over me as I realized they were gone. The room felt different, like the air had thickened with dread. I peered around, searching for them, but they were nowhere to be found. In a state of confusion and fear, I rushed out of the room and into the dimly lit hallway. I called out for them, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the silence. The hotel, once lively with other guests, now felt hauntingly deserted. I scoured the entire building, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no sign of my parents. As I reached the lobby, I was met with a disturbing sight. The front door was wide open, and the night's chilling breeze swept in. The hotel was eerily quiet. My parents' car was still parked outside, but they were nowhere to be seen. Tears welled up in my eyes as I frantically approached the front desk. A burly night clerk, half asleep, listened to my frantic explanation. He made a phone call, and soon the police were on their way. Hours passed like an eternity. The realization that my parents were missing gnawing in my young mind. Finally, the police brought some answers. They found my parents bound and gagged in the woods nearby. The officers explained that the assailant had been targeting a wealthy businessman staying at the hotel, believing my father was him. When my parents didn't comply with his demands, he left them in the woods, helpless. Though my parents were alive, they were shaken and bruised. The traumatic experience haunted them for years, and our idyllic family trip had transformed into a nightmare. It became a story rarely spoken of, a wound that never quite healed. That night at the Grand Haven Hotel had imprinted a sense of vulnerability and fear deep within my young heart. The safe haven I'd once known had become a place of darkness and despair. It was a chilling encounter that left scars not only on me, but on my family as well. We couldn't erase the memory of that terrifying night when the innocence of childhood had been shattered by a cruel reality.